Hi everyone, I'm Ben and you're watching The Snecker Show. And a few years ago I made a video showing how to build these cool cheese and cracker serving trays. And there has been enough interest in that video, either because of the process that I used or for the product itself, that I ended up doing a follow-up a couple of years later showing how to make the jig that you need to make the trays. And some people wanted some more detail on top of that, so recently I put together the digital plans, which you can now download I have them on Etsy and Ko-fi currently. Ko-fi, coffee, I'm not sure how you say it, but link in the description. You can download the plans to get the measurements and markings right. And some people don't want to build the jig at all, they just want to jump straight to the fun part. And for them, I am also selling a limited quantity of jigs. And that will continue for as long as time and attention span permit. And either of those can be kind of flaky with me, so get them while they're hot, or at least while they're available. Moving on, the reason that we're here today is not self-promotion. I actually have a purpose for being here that benefits, hopefully, you. Some people have had a little bit of trouble with this project in hollowing out the inside. And it's either because of, from being new with a router or not familiar with the project, or just simple operator error or equipment malfunction. I mean, we all make mistakes in the workshop and get surprised on every single freaking project. I mean, every one. One of these days I would like to do a project with no mistakes, but it just hasn't happened yet. So anyway, some people have had some trouble with the inside of this jig, or with the inside of this tray, and so I wanted to go back to the original video and cover a bit more detail on that part, just to make it a little bit easier to cut out some of the pain points. And my kid just woke up from his nap. So let's get back to the router table later and we'll take a look at what I have set up. Before we get to the routing tips, here's a quick look at my work area. The first time I did this, I was over here at my bench vise, and I had a shield set up behind it to catch some of the dust because I didn't have any dust collection on my router, and it was also a non-variable speed router, meaning I couldn't control the speed, so it was going too fast and was frequently burning the wood. And this time I'm over here, closer to the dust collector. I'm using both the dust collection system and the shop vac. The shop vac moves the air a little bit faster, so it tends to do better with the dust collection that's built into the routers. And the dust collector I'm just using mostly to catch the fine dust, get some of that out of the air so I can breathe better. And I got the hose running up over my garage door track because that's what I got to work with. And it's held on there with some hose clamps to make sure that it doesn't bump into those bandsaw blades, because I do not want those falling on my head again. Maybe just forget you saw that. And this is what I got set up for holding the jig in place. Instead of using the bench vise, which not everybody has, I just have a piece of plywood there with a fence in the back, and then I can clamp onto that. And we'll take a closer look at that in a minute. And here are some that I have already completed. I've been doing this little by little as time permits. And here are some more that I still need to do. And here are some of the other supplies that you're going to want to have handy. So, moving on to the routing tips. Tip number one is to choose the right router bit. Not all router bits are created equal, and a higher quality bit is generally going to give you a smoother cut with less burning of the wood. There's several good brands to choose from. This one is a white side. I'll put a link to it in the video description. And it's important to choose a good bit because a better cut means that you're going to have to spend less time sanding later. As long as you pay attention to tip number 2. Keep your router bits clean. The more you cut, the more pitch is going to burn onto your bit, and the more pitch burns onto your bit, the rougher your cuts are going to be, which again means more time and money sanding later.
I don't like sand.
There are several good options for cleaning router bits, but I just use Simple Green. It's cheap and easy to find. If you haven't gone too long without cleaning, sometimes a little bit of Simple Green on a toothbrush is enough to get back to clean metal. And I also like to use another toothbrush to brush on some wax, just to give it a little bit of a delay before the pitch starts to build up again. It's not going to stay on there for too long, but every little bit helps. Number 3, if your router has dust collection, use it. If it doesn't, just do the best you can with whatever you got and stop periodically to vacuum out the chips. The chips are going to make it harder to see what you're doing, and they can get stuck between your router bit bearing and the side of the template, which is going to lead to inconsistent results. Number 4, set your depth stops and use them. If you haven't used this feature on your router previously, or this guy right here, you want to read your manual and get familiar with it, because this is for allowing you to return to a fixed depth each time. I can move this rod down a little bit so I can't go quite as far, move it back up to get some more distance, and these things right here, this piece rotates, so I can make my first cut and not take off too much material, and then I can rotate this 1/4 of an inch and move down to my next cut and take off a little bit more material. And then when I go back to repeat the process, I know I'm going to be going to the same place each time. Now for this project, I'm using this custom screw right here. I set it to the height that I needed and then tightened up that nut so it doesn't wobble loose when the router starts vibrating. That might not be the right one for you. This is going to depend on how far up or down you have this rod, how far the router bit is into the collet, how tall the router bit is, thickness of the jig, a whole bunch of stuff. But I set up this one right here, and I know that when I return to that screw right there, that custom depth stop, and I plunge down, lock my router, I know that my bearing is going to be contacting the side of the jig. That's pretty important to have that confidence on your first cut, because you're going to be taking off a bit of material, and if your router bit is not contacting the side of the jig, you're probably going to get a little bit of a jump at some point and ruin your jig and your project board. And it's also just plain dangerous. So this is a 3/4 of an inch thick template, and that works very well with this particular bit. So you're not taking too much on the first pass, but you can still get down deep enough to have a relatively deep well in your tray. If this were a thinner template, you probably wouldn't be able to get that bearing contacting the side of the jig on your first pass, and you would either have to just kind of freehand it and hope for the best, and that usually doesn't work out that well with a router, or you would have to take too aggressive of a cut on your first pass, and that's also equally dangerous. So get familiar with your depth stops, take the time to set it up before your project, and it's just going to make the whole thing a lot smoother and more repeatable. Moving on to number 5, make sure that your plunge locking mechanism is secure. When you plunge down, you might have to push it down, might have to let go, but if you don't push it tight enough, at least with this DeWalt, it might pop back up while you're in the middle of cutting and you could nick your jig, which I may have done with mine, but it's all right because I already fixed it. I'm usually a pretty big fan of DeWalt stuff, and I think the router is great, but I don't like this locking mechanism because you have to push it down and then lock this, and if you don't do it enough, it's going to pop loose on you. So make sure that that's secure. That's compared to my very old 20-plus-year-old Porter cable router, where you can't push it down until you push on that locking mechanism, and then once you let go, it's not going anywhere. I think that's a little bit easier in my opinion. So if I buy another router, I'm going to make sure that the locking mechanism makes you push on it to push down, because that makes sense. You're pushing down, and then when you let go, you don't have to worry about anything beyond that. Whereas with this one, you can just push down right away, but then you have to try to get your thumb over here and push down on there, which is a little bit awkward when you're trying to hold a bit inside the wood. So the point is, make sure that that thing is secure, otherwise you're going to have a surprise. On to number 6, proper bit speed. Most modern routers are going to have some kind of variable speed control, unlike the one that I used the first time I did this project. And if you turn the dial down to a lower number, the bit is going to spin slower. And if you turn it up to a higher number, the bit is going to spin faster. Faster is not always better. Generally, rule of thumb is that for a smaller diameter bit, you're going to use a higher speed. And for a larger diameter bit, like this raised panel bit, you're going to use a lower speed. Now, part of the reason for that is that if I were to run this bit right here on speed 6, and then run this thing on speed 6, they would not actually be cutting at the same speed. Even though this thing may be rotating at, I don't know what it says on here, maybe 25, 30,000 rotations per minute. This thing has a smaller diameter, so in the amount of time it takes it to make one rotation, the outside of this bit would have to move a lot faster to make that rotation. So even if you're running them both on speed 6, this bigger bit is going to be moving a lot faster on the outer part of the cutting edge. So that's pretty dangerous. And it also leads to burning on the wood if the bit is moving too fast. If you go too slow, you're going to end up with chatter and vibration. You can look up charts online to figure out the recommended bit speed for the different sizes of router bits, but really it's just up to feel. If you have some scrap wood, I would say try cutting a little bit slower, and if you feel too much chatter and vibration, take the speed up until it feels just about right. Another thing to keep in mind is that softer woods, you can generally run the router at a higher speed. You're not going to have any problems. But harder woods, more difficult to cut. There's going to be a little bit more strain on the bit if you go at a higher speed, so you might want to slow it down a little bit for the harder woods. Once again, use a piece of scrap wood, try it out, and just find the speed that feels right. And if it feels right, if it works right, it is right. We made it to number 7, and that is to always keep the router moving while the bit is cutting the wood. If you slow down or stop, and that router bit is spinning and touching the wood, you're probably going to leave a burn mark that you're going to have to sand out later. The most likely place for this to happen is in these inside corners where you tend to slow down as you're changing direction. And this is unfortunate because the inside corners of the tray also happen to be the most difficult areas to sand, and nobody wants to do any more sanding. So try to keep the router moving as you're turning those corners. You don't want to go too fast because if you push through too quickly, you might tear out more grain when you're going against the grain. You don't want to have tear out because then you have to sand that as well. But find the right speed, and when you turn that corner, if you don't feel like you got all the way in, don't try to push it too hard in there to make sure that you get the corner, because that's going to slow you down. Just keep going through, and if you don't feel like you got all the way in, just complete your lap, come back for another one, and the next time you can try again to get all the way into that corner without stopping. Sooner or later you're going to get it right, but as long as you keep the router moving, you're just going to be taking a bunch of nice light passes, and that's just going to result in a cleaner cut with less tear out. Another place where you want to make sure that you keep the router moving is when you're plunging initially. You don't want to just go straight down. And the reason for that is because this router bit doesn't have a center spur. These types of bowl and tray bits generally don't have a center spur. They're like a drill bit for drilling down into the wood. So what you're getting is the two sides of the bit, they're going to be twisting.
Heart's still working means synapses are still firing. We just need to get a message through.
As they contact the wood, and if you just go straight down, they're going to twist out a little circle in the bottom of your project board, and you'll have to sand that out later. So as you're plunging with your first cut, moving along the depth with the router bit as centered in the tray as possible, just for safety, because your bearing isn't contacting the sides yet, keep the router moving and push down to your first cut, and then lock this thing into place as good as you can and keep that router bit moving. And that's going to give you a better, flatter bottom on your project board. I almost forgot a very important tip number 8, and that is cutting in the right direction. And this is something that tends to confuse people with routers, so I'm going to make it very, very simple. If you're going around the inside, you cut clockwise. If you're going around the outside, you cut counterclockwise. Unless you're in a router table, and then on the outside you would go clockwise, and on the inside counterclockwise. Oh man, now I'm confused. All right, let's make it simpler. This is a spinning wheel. When this spinning wheel contacts the wood, which way is it going to run? That way. So I want to cut the other way because I don't want my router to run away from me.
Hurry! He's trying to get loose!
If I'm on this wall, that spinning wheel is going to drive that way. So I want to cut the other way because I don't want my router to run away from me. Out here, it's going to go that way. So I'm going to cut this way. And on the back, it's going to run that way, so I'm going to cut this way. So don't think about it as clockwise, counterclockwise, left, right. Just think about which way that wheel is going to run when it contacts the surface and cut the other way. When you are finally ready to move on to your last depth stop, there's something that you can do to make sure that your last cut is going to be even cleaner and smoother than it otherwise would have been. And that is just to divide this into 2 cuts. Now, grab yourself some masking tape. Neat little trick here. And maybe 2 pieces is going to be enough. It doesn't take a lot. And stick that on your depth stop. That's just raising it up just a little bit so that you can make that cut or make that pass and clean everything out as best you can. Maybe you get a little bit of tear out in the corners. Maybe you get a little bit of burning. If you do, your next pass, when you pull that off, is going to be a very slight shaving. And that's just going to give you a cleaner finish than you would have had otherwise. And again, that's going to result in less time spent sanding, and that makes everybody happy. And the last other thing that you want to do on that final pass is you might have some chips that got packed up against the side of the template. I usually wax this on the top and on the inside here, not on the bottom, because I don't want it sliding around too much. But I just go around and use either a Scotch-Brite pad or just my finger and try to get all those chips off of the side, because the router bearing will follow those little bumps and it'll leave a rougher finish on the final board. So your last pass, pull off the masking tape, make sure that your template is clean, and you're going to have a great finish. After you do that final pass and you think you got everything just right, don't take it all apart just yet. Just reach in there and feel all of the details to make sure that you didn't miss anything, because it's going to be a whole lot easier to pop the router back on and do one more run than it is to try to get it with a chisel or sandpaper later. So just check it, make sure that everything's right, and if it is, take everything apart and enjoy what you did. And look at those smooth corners. That is routed only, no sanding. And after you're finished admiring your work, move on to tip number 2. Remember what it was? Keep your bit clean. Unplug your router. If you can do it up here, that's cool. If not, go down to the floor. It's worth it for this step. And this doesn't have to be very complicated. Just plunge down to your deepest depth, so your router bit's sticking out there. Get a little bit of paste wax. And I just put some on the toothbrush and I clean that off again. Just make sure that those cutters are spotless. And if you can't get all the dust off and the pitch off, just get your other toothbrush with some simple green and you can usually brush that right off. That's a small step to get the same quality of finish on your next board. If you don't do this, every cut that you make is going to result in more pitch buildup on here, and every cut is just going to get a little bit worse than the one before it. So, little step, I just put some wax on there, I'm done, and I am ready to plug this thing back in and start over again on my first death stop. Rock and roll. I think that about does it for tips, so now I'm going to do one of these for real if you want to stick around for a little bit longer. Ash, cherry, more ash, purple heart, hickory, and more cherry. I'm going to slide this into the jig. And if you already marked it, you can just slide up to your pencil markings, but I'm going to use the alignment hole. Line it up with the handle. And put it up against this fence just so it doesn't move, and that gives me something to clamp up to. All right, I think we're ready to go. think that was a win. Let's take a look. I'm going to move into some better light. Bring it in for the inspection. I think that looks great. That is smooth and flat on the bottom. No burning in the corners. Only thing I don't really like about this one is that that little wall of ash is too thin. And I think that I might go back to the jig, offset the side rails a little bit, and cut that a little bit thinner, and then do the same on the other side so it's symmetrical. Like I said, every single project, something goes wrong. You just got to deal with it and fix it. There we go. Dealt with, fixed, sanded, and oiled. Didn't want you to think I was bluffing. Now I got 15 more to do. Hope that was helpful, and thanks for watching.